And we're live.
Hi guys, Amala here with PragerU. I last night did a debate, and actually one of my first ones in a live debate about critical race theory on a show called Black News Tonight with Marc Lamont Hill. You might recognize Marc Lamont Hill from a lot of viral videos of clips that go viral from his show where he debates people over different subject matters. Now, I got asked to go on his show and talk about critical race theory, sort of how it's infiltrating public schools, which is something that Marc Lamont Hill denies is happening typically. But we had a really great civil discussion about it, and I wanted to react to our back and forth because oftentimes I find, you guys know me, I talk about this all the time on Will and Amala Live, that I get nervous before I go on shows or do speeches or anything like that. And I think we all have those moments where you get in a debate with somebody, whether civil or something else, and you go, man, I wish I would have said that thing, or I wish I could have made that point, or I wish I had enough time. So I'm going to react to this. I have not watched this yet. As I said, I just did this last night. And during this, I didn't get to see Marc Lamont Hill's face because, you know, I'm looking at the camera the entire time. Our computer screens are far on the other side of the room. So it's going to be interesting to see his reaction to my words. And hopefully I'll get in a few more points just so I feel like we don't miss any of the substantive points that should be made when we talk about critical race theory in school. So let's get into that. Here we go.
We move to a topic that's arguably the biggest fault line of our current culture wars, critical race theory. Within the last year, 35 states have introduced restrictive bills, and 14 states have already imposed these restrictions, banning the theory and limiting how teachers can discuss racism in their classrooms. And now, the GOP-led states have entered the next stage in their attacks. It's called curriculum transparency. According to NBC News, in at least 12 states, lawmakers have introduced legislation to mandate that schools disclose all of their teaching materials online. This list would include books, articles, videos, and it comes as the governors of Arizona, Florida, and Iowa all called for curriculum transparency laws in their speeches this month. Joining me now to discuss the conservatives' concerns regarding critical race theory in schools and the recent push for curriculum transparency is the PragerU personality, Amala. She is the co-host of...
It was close. I will say, on the commercial break, he did ask me how to pronounce my name, it's a tough one for everybody. So that's totally fine.
Yeah, I was kind of a butcher, I'm not going to lie.
I want to go ahead and say I hate looking at myself and watching myself talk. So if I'm cringing while I'm reacting to this, just prepare yourselves for that. Here we go.
Will and Amala, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me on, Mark. And I want to go ahead and say I think we're going to find a lot more agreement than disagreement on the subject matter, I hope.
I hope so, too. I hope to arrive at an interesting place, whether we agree or disagree.
Right.
I think the first thing I'd say is the idea of curriculum transparency, for me, isn't the problem. I think public education should be public. People should know what's in the curriculum. Parents should have a right to know what their kids are learning, what teachers are teaching. I would want to know, if I were a parent in a Florida school or a Virginia school, what my third grader is learning.
Pause right there. Smart thing to do when you debate somebody is always make the proper concessions at the outset of your debate, so you know, hey, we share some common ground on this subject matter, and it does make the discussion more civil. So thanks to Mark for making that concession about saying that transparency is an important thing regardless of what side of the aisle you lie on. Let's continue.
It totally makes sense to me. My concern, and I want to know what you think, is that the purpose of this transparency isn't to actually just force us to know what's in the curriculum, but rather to police curriculum in ways that limit certain kinds of conversation, the biggest one being the one on race.
Yeah, I do think that is going to be part of what happens here. I think with the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw a lot of kids home from school and parents actually getting a look at what teachers were teaching, and some of these parents were not happy. Now, as far as critical race theory is a part of that, I do think there are tenets of critical race theory, of the law theory, that have been distilled down and maybe even miscommunicated in these public schools that are being used to teach young children. And parents got to see that. They got to see those tenets of critical race theory being taught to their kids. And I think now that is what's pushing this new push for transparency. They want to see what their kids are being taught, and I think in a lot of states see if critical race theory has anything to do with it, and maybe they will come after it and try to take that away from the curriculum. But I think it depends on how exactly race is being talked about.
what are the ways that race is being talked about that people are finding so problematic? You say it's parents. I'm not convinced it's starting with parents, but let's for a moment.
Pause there. I should have made a point about the fact that it is very much a movement that is being driven by parents. We see that with the numerous videos that are coming out of school boards of parents showing up and saying, hey, I got to look at the book that you sent my 7-year-old home with, and it has some really inappropriate conversations about race in it. Now, is there room to talk about race with children? Absolutely. Not to the extent that it's happening. And there are certain tenets of critical race theory, as I stated prior, that are helpful when talking about race. One tenet of critical race theory, that race is a social construct, completely agree with that. There are other tenets like whiteness as property, which we'll get to in this discussion, that I completely disagree with. And those are the things that kids are coming home with to their parents. And I do largely think this is a parent-led movement. Let's continue.
Say it is. What is causing people to be upset?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, when we look at critical race theory, I want to say there are a few things that I agree with when it comes to the theory that race is a social construct. I think that should absolutely be being taught to children from a young age, because that's an important lesson. The fact that kids don't have a unitary identity, that they can have intersectional identities attached to them, I think that's important. But I think parts and tenets of critical race theory that are getting into schools is the idea of whiteness as an identity, or that racism infiltrates every facet of society, or even the statement that whiteness is property that kids can own and use as a sign of power and privilege. And I think when you teach that to specifically young children, it can be extremely divisive. I, as a young black child, and this, I agree, this is anecdotal, was taught that life was going to be different for me by virtue of being a black female. And I harbored a lot of that divisiveness in my mind, a lot of that hatred in my mind, and I did direct it towards white students. And I think it can be harmful to teach children those tenets.
Pause there. So I mentioned a few things that I take qualms with critical race theory. And I think there should be a differentiation between the original traditional form of critical race theory with names that you might recognize, like Derek Bell. Derek Bell is what we would call a critical race theory purist. Richard Delgado's, your Gene Stefancics, they sort of take it and morph it a little bit. So race being a social construct, like I said, completely agree. People having not a singular unitary identity, completely agree. But then we get into these parts of critical race theory where it says whiteness is property, or that meritocracy is an extension of white supremacy, which is just a crazy thing to say. And you'll hear a lot on the left. People will say, well, critical race theory is simply a law theory. It's not being used in schools. But in critical race theory, the law theory, where it writes in meritocracy is an extension of white supremacy. That's a direct transfer to schools, because what we're doing now is telling black children and students of all races, really, we're lowering their standards because we are looking at schools. I'll give Oregon as an example. The governor of Oregon got rid of a lot of the requirements to graduate: math proficiency, reading proficiency, writing proficiency, because they saw that there was a disparate impact on black students. Black students were graduating at a lower rate. So they went, okay, maybe we don't need to look at this through meritocracy because that's an extension of white supremacy. Instead, we'll just lower the standards so that more black children and Hispanic children and brown children graduate. So you are taking a tenet of critical race theory, meritocracy being an outbranch of white supremacy, distilling it down and using that to lower the standards of your students' academics. So it's clearly taking inspiration from critical race theory, which is a tactic that a lot of leftists will use, is just saying, no, it's a law theory. It's just being taught in schools. And there's no way that we're using this in public institutions or in companies. And there are clear links between critical race theory and what's being practiced in our public schools. Let's continue.
So I'll push back a little bit. Just a clarifying point. The idea that Professor Cheryl Harris had around whiteness as property wasn't to teach that whiteness is something that should be used as property and wielded. I think we would all agree that would be problematic. But to talk about how in American life, whiteness can function as property. It can be something that we have, as George Lipschitz said, a possessive investment in. People use whiteness as property. People think about whiteness and trade whiteness in everyday conversation and lean on it. A good example might be, as W.E.B. Du Bois talked about in Black Reconstruction, this idea that, the white worker should want to end slavery too, because as long as there are enslaved people, they will be priced out of the market. They'll never get living wages if there's a person working unpaid. But many times the white worker would be invested in whiteness and closing ranks around their whiteness and side with the planter or the bosses, the slaveholders rather than the slaves, because they were closing ranks around their whiteness. In that way, that's sort of an early way of thinking about whiteness as a form of property. So they actually would argue that we shouldn't be doing that, right? So I think the key oftentimes is distilling from the top down this information in a way that doesn't sort of misrepresent it.
Okay, I think I in no way misrepresented what was written on whiteness being property. I completely disagree with the fact that you can use whiteness as property. And I think the example with slavery and its abolition and reconstruction of using whiteness as property completely leaves out examples of white people who helped to abolish slavery, who helped Harriet Tubman in the Underground Railroad. There were several white people who were clearly against slavery as an institution and as a practice, and they were not using their whiteness as property to uphold a system. So where there are examples of people, quote unquote, using whiteness, there are so many examples to the contrary. I don't believe there's a singular piece of property that comes along with being born white in this nation that you can use for privilege and power.
But you raise another interesting point, not around sort of race as a social construct. I think we all agree with that. But this idea that by virtue of being, in your case, a black woman, that somehow your life is unavoidably going to be different than someone else's experience. Tell me why that's not true.
It's true. It's not true because I exist. So there are so many people, so many black people, brown people, Hispanic people whose lives are really no different than anyone else's by any means in regard to race and how they get treated. And I know that is an anecdotal statement to make, but there is no singular law or societal standard that treats someone like me any different than it would treat someone like Taylor. So if you don't have an actual piece of evidence to show how black and brown people are being treated differently than white people, there is really no argument to be made there. And myself and Marc Lamont Hill are both living, breathing examples of that. He's a very successful black man. I'm very successful in what I do, although on different sides of the aisle. So it clearly shows that we are very much in a state of progress in this nation. Let's continue. First and foremost, to address the whiteness part, I don't think you can attach a certain characteristic to a group of people simply because they are white. I don't think that every white person has the ability to use their whiteness as property or as some sort of power or privilege over another minority or marginalized group. And as far as it pertains to my identity and being a black female, and I'll say a half black female, I don't think there is anything attached to my quote unquote blackness that has to do with outcomes that I'm going to come in contact with in my life. I've led a very successful life. You've led a very successful life. We both happen to be black. And as far as my life is concerned, there were no barriers or structures set in place. There's no legislation set in place. For me, there's no societal expectation set in place for me that has held me back in. I pause that. There actually is a societal expectation set on you for being a black person, and that is that you will be a leftist and that you will vote blue, and that is societal expectation. And I'll tell you, I experienced more racism than I've ever experienced in my life when I went against that societal expectation. So that is a point that should have been made. Anyway, during my education or during my career. And I, in fact, grew up in a very rural, white, conservative area in Florida as a young black radical leftist and had no issue.
So let's look at a few things. When you say that there are no structures or barriers that would limit your ability to thrive or succeed in America, I think it would be problematic to presume that because you had a good outcome, that means that you had that the structures aren't there. It just means you could have succeeded despite those outcomes, not because they don't exist.
I would ask, and I should have asked, name one structure. Name a structure that is set in place that holds Black people back in this country. And I think you'd be hard pressed to point to one. Again, no single piece of law, no single societal standard other than where you're meant to vote and what side of the aisle you're meant to be on. There is no bit of systemic racism that they can point to with evidence. Continue.
But when you look at things, for example, differential sentencing in drug policy, when you look at the fact that even when we control for race and class, or excuse me, even when we control for class in schools, we see different outcomes in school performance for Black children versus white children. When we look at
Okay, pause. So much was just said there. Let's look at sentencing. So I am actually currently working on a video about systemic racism, and one of the issues that I did have a little hang on was sentencing in U.S. courts. The stats show that Black people are sentenced 20% higher sentences for the same crime as white people. Now, when I actually went and did a deep dive into this, there are studies that account for race and class when looking at this issue. However, they don't account for the actual judicial system, which I will mention this at some point. But a study that he is going to reference does not take into account the weapon that was used, how many people were harmed in the incidents, how many times this person has been a perpetrator of this crime, how many people's lives were put in danger by the incident. And even if you prove that with all of those factors of variability taken into account, even if you prove that there is still disparity among Black and white sentencing, it does not prove a systemic problem because there is no legislation put forth that says that judges have to systemically be discriminatory towards Black people. What you would find if you accounted for all those variables, I'm sure, is a far less percentage than 20%. And what you would find is really judges who are choosing to sentence people higher. Now, could those be racist judges? Absolutely. But does that point to a systemic problem or a problem that is held up by the institutions of law in this country? No, it does not. Now, he also talked about schooling disparities and Black kids being suspended or having more infractions at school than white kids. And when we look at that, again, he says it's controlled for class, but there are so many other variables that it's not controlled for. It's not controlled for culture. It's not controlled for two-parent household. It's not controlled for whether or not you were read to as a child. And a great book to read about this subject matter is Discrimination and Disparities by Tom Sowell, where he talks about so many other prerequisites for success, as he calls them. So markers and characteristics of your early life and childhood that can mark how successful you'll be in the future and in school. There are so many prerequisites for success that are far more important than race. And by focusing on race, we do ourselves a disservice because we should be focusing on two-parent households, on reading to young children, on class, on generating income, things like that. So we do ourselves a disservice by focusing so much on race. Let's keep going.
Suspension rates and expulsion rates among Black and white students. Black students are overrepresented, even for the same acts. Not just not just that the Black guys are doing something worse. There's a bunch of stuff going. Actually, let me take a break because I want to ask you this question properly. I don't want to rush you into an answer. So let's take a break, and when we come back, I want to make sure that we have finished our conversation because I'm enjoying talking to you. Everybody, stay right here. I want to continue my discussion around critical race theory with the PragerU personality and conservative influencer, Amala Ekpanabi. Don't go
so
anywhere.
Close. So close. Oh, goodness. So commercial break here. I'm going to skip this little YouTube ad, but I just want to say super civil discourse. So happy to be a part of this. So happy that Mark was kind and listened and there was no interruption. We both were just very, very civil in this discussion, which is what we need when it comes to hot topics like this, because what makes these topics uncomfortable to talk about is people's reactions to them. And if you can control your reaction, we can have good discussions that hopefully lead to a solution. So let's keep watching.
Welcome back to Black News Tonight. We continue our discussion around critical race theory and the concerns that conservatives have regarding its teaching in schools, as well as the recent push for curriculum transparency. I'm back with the PragerU personality, Amala Ekpanabi. She is the
better that time. See, we did the commercial break.
Again, a rising star in the conservative camp. Amala, one of the things you talked about, and this would be my critique. I often feel like Black conservatives are often championed and spotlighted if they take the position. And I'm not saying you're not sincere in your position, but when they take the position that race is not a barrier, that their blackness is not a barrier, that color blindness and race neutrality is something that we should aspire to without considering what's actually happening on the ground right now. And so I was sort of struck before the break when you talked about saying that, you know, your race hasn't been an impediment to your success in the country. And I'm thinking, well, how do we explain the fact, just to use one example, differential sentencing for black and white? The black people get longer sentences for the same crime. We get the death penalty more often. We get suspended more. I mean, all these outcomes, when you control for your even class, black people still get the worst end of it. And I would stipulate we shouldn't do this stuff. You shouldn't rob anybody. You shouldn't get suspended from school. But
Good
if
concession.
you make a bad choice, black people are getting the worst outcome. If race isn't a factor here and an impediment, how do you explain it?
I do want to harken on one thing. You said the possibility of me succeeding despite the outcomes, and I think that is something that happens. And I do think that racism is real. I by no means want to brush off racism happening in our country. I just don't think it is as big of an issue as we are making it. And one thing that I like about critical race theory is it's talk about intersectionality and the presence of class and having two parents and your finances being important when it comes to your outcomes. I wish they held up those characteristics as far more important than race. I think that tends to be the issue. And when we look at what you said, sentencing in the court of law, this is something that I've actually been trying to look into as far as systemic racism goes. And the only thing that I could find was from the U.S. Sentencing Commission saying that the markers for the way that they sentence crime are obviously not racialized markers, but crimes do not have a formulaic sentencing. And this is across the board, across all jurisdictions. There's no formulaic sentencing for specific crimes. And often these statistics that come out about black people being sentenced more than white people bear no interest in prior records, in what sort of weapon was used, how many people were involved in the incident. And when it comes to sentencing, these different characteristics can play a large role in how things turn out. Now, could a portion of sentencing differentials be due to racism? Yes, I'm willing to concede that at any point. But I don't think it is as big of an issue as we are making it out to be in this country, and it's harming children to teach them that it is.
How so? So when we tell a child, because remember, sentencing differentials aren't being taught like in first grade, right? When we read a book like
Sure.
Skin Like Mine, or when we talk about this stuff, we're talking about the fact that race is an identity, and it's an important thing to think about in the world, and that we don't want to pretend that we don't have a racial identity, because what happens is if you don't have a racial identity and you live in a world where whiteness is culturally dominant, then what ends up happening is, as a black person, you always grow up thinking that you're less than. You grow up thinking you have the wrong hips and lips and nose. You think that the way that a news anchor or a model or an actress or a president should look is like a white guy, because that's the only image of that thing that you see. I mean, I'll use you as an example, right? Imagine if no one ever saw you on TV as a black conservative, and all I ever saw in conservatives was Ben Shapiro. Then I would grow up thinking that to be a young conservative, I had to look like or be like Ben Shapiro. And as a black girl, I might not know that you're even possible. And what I'm saying,
It's so funny because it's the very people who, and I'm not accusing Marc Lamont Hill of this, it's the people on his side of the aisle that say that you should not be a black conservative, who now use that as an example of, look at you, you're giving representation to a side that we would not have seen before. It's the same side that says that I should not exist, that a black person should not be conservative, that says those things and uses that as an example when it's suitable. So yeah, that's an interesting thing that I just noticed. Let's continue.
Saying is systemically, we often teach people that there's only one way to fit and only one way to be, and because whiteness is the norm and dominant, schools have to do a job of pushing back against that, because when they remain neutral, they reinforce whiteness as the center.
Sure, I think it's a sort of reductive way to look at things, and I think it's a failure in thinking and teaching to have a kid who looks and sees whiteness a lot and think that that's the standard. What should be taught to that child is that, yes, there are more white people in the United States of America, but there are people of all colors and they look differently. And when you look at somebody who looks different, nothing is going to be tied to that attribute. No attribute is tied to my race, to my blackness, or to my whiteness that I have 50% of. There's no power, no privilege that is encapsulated in that comes with that. And when you teach children that, which I guess you would call racial neutrality or color blindness, that's an important lesson for them. That's what's going to help them. If you see mainly white news anchors, which I think is vastly different today. I think we see a lot of diversity in our news today. It's not my fault that you start to think that that is the standard and the regular. It's the fault of the people who didn't teach you that that's not the case, that you can be anything, and we should be teaching students that they can be, that whiteness does not hold any power or privilege, that in fact, you being a black kid, you can do just as much as they can, and there's going to be no difference in the way that you're treated. And I think that's going to help students more than any sort of critical race theory narrative.
Yeah, and I'll pause there. And again, anecdotal example here. But if you are going to use me as an example, I'd be a prime example for that. I grew up, again, in a rural, conservative, white area in Florida. What leftists would call a hotbed for systemic racism, or at least socialized racism. Experienced none of that. But because I was taught as a young child that racism was prevalent, that it was systemic, I harbored that hatred and that feeling in my brain, despite every single experience that I had to the contrary. Can't pin down a really a single instance of racism in my childhood. Yet because the narrative was taught to me, as they are doing to young kids in these schools, I harbored the hatred, I harbored the divisiveness, and I felt like I needed to be an activist. So what you are doing is robbing young children of their agency by teaching them that, especially when the society does not truly reflect that in its systems and institutions. We're gonna maybe close this out here. Let's see.
But I think that's exactly what critical race theory is teaching, right? The things you said, the shoulds that you're talking about, that race shouldn't matter and that people shouldn't be treated differently because of race, those are all normative things, right? That's how we want the world to be. And I think not just critical race theory, but all the school curriculums, which I would argue aren't critical race theory, but all these school curricula are making those same arguments. They're also simply pointing out that that's not where we are now. And so we have to add these correctives because, again, if we don't say anything about it, if we say nothing about race in a world that normalizes these things, then I think we do run the risk or not even run the risk. I think we inevitably will reinforce whiteness as the center. And
no, that if you don't talk about race, whiteness is nothing. If you don't talk about race, blackness is nothing. If you don't talk about race, being Asian is nothing. That's the goal here. Race neutrality and colorblindness, which critical race theory is avidly against, and again is being distilled down into our public schools, is the way to go. You'll see a Morgan Freeman interview that he did. You said you want to end racism? Stop talking about it. And that's exactly what we should be doing. But instead, we are pushing it into our schools and pushing it onto young people.
And I think you're right. We should say, hey, you know, your race shouldn't determine your outcome. But I think it's okay to say to kids, hey, there will be moments in the world where you're going to be taught that your skin's not beautiful. So I need you to know that. And
woo! And I missed this when I first did this interview, and I completely glossed over it. Who's to say there's going to be moments where you're taught that your skin is not beautiful? I've never heard that in my life, other than leftist people telling me that's what people think. I have never, ever, ever experienced or seen any sort of writing, statement put out, legislation put out, societal standard put out that says that black is not beautiful. In fact, blackness is celebrated. And that's another point that I should have made during this interview, is that not only in the area that I grew up, a predominantly white area, was my blackness accepted as great and as beautiful, but actually it was incentivized to be black. I would have gotten scholarships for being black. I would have been the first step for job opportunities for being black. People wanted to highlight me for their diversity, endeavors. So if anything, there are lots of privileges that come along with having my skin color and my gender. Let's close out here.
And you're right. And just finally, because we only have about 1 minute left, and I'll give you the last word. When we talk about, you mentioned being 50% white and 50% black, that might be true in the abstract, but you had to tell me that. When you walk through the world, no one says, look at that half black, half white sister. They say she's black, just like they say I'm black. And so the social world has a reality that's different than our biological makeup. Biologically, black, white, red, yellow, we all the same. But socially, you're black and I'm black. And so to pretend that that's not the case because of mere pure biology also doesn't set us up for the world that we actually have to live in. What would you say to that? And you had the last word.
I would say that we do live in a world that is better than people think it is. I don't think racism is the problem that we make it out to be, and we would do a service to ourselves to focus less on race while still acknowledging that racism exists, and focus more on class and two-parent households and how to generate income and generate small businesses. And teaching young people those tenets of being successful in America is far more important than dividing them based on race in our schools. It's going to help them to be more successful. They won't harbor hatred or divisiveness towards students and their peers, and they're going to have better outcomes. That would be my final word here.
There we go. That is the end of my time on Marc Lamont Hill. I'm trying to think if I have any other tangential points to make here. He did make the point that I'm not seen any differently walking the street. I'm seen as a black woman, and that may be the case. I get asked all the time what my race and what my ethnicity is, so I'm not sure that that is true. I think I'm sort of racially ambiguous as far as society goes. But again, it doesn't speak to a difference in the way that I'm treated. Just because somebody perceives me as black, it doesn't change the way that they treat me, or again, the way that I'm treated by our systems and institutions. And if we don't have evidence to prove that people of my skin tone or darker are treated differently in those systems, then critical race theory is very much debunked, because it's a law theory that states that our country is founded in racism, it's perpetuated with slavery and with Jim Crow, and that baked into the crust of our country is racism that we cannot avoid. And because that is the truth, we must always look at race. We must have conversations about race, and we must divide people up by race. And that theory is debunked, because there is no evidence to support it. And the few points of evidence that he placed forth in this argument are unsubstantiated as far as the studies go, and the variables that weren't accounted for when we looked at this. And what we do, and a final word that I also should have made, is we look at the world and we divide it into race, and we go, well, this is disproportionately affecting black people or Hispanic people or Asian people or Native Americans. And because they are being disproportionately affected, we immediately cry racism. And that is a harmful thing to do, because now that you've cried racism, you've ignored all the other factors that could be causing this problem. And it is a problem. It's a problem that black people don't have as much income, that their inner city schools don't have resourcing. It's a problem that we don't have two-parent households, but we look at it and we just go racism, 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 instead of going down to the root and finding out what is actually causing it. And again, we do ourselves a disservice, because these problems are going to continue. And we've seen that. How long have we heard the narrative of systemic racism in this country? I was doing that 4 years ago when I was working for the left, crying systemic racism, fighting it, bringing my picket signs out and going to yell at politicians and police officers and all of this. And we've been doing this for years to no avail. And I would love to have somebody point out anything that has been done in the name of systemic racism that has actually caused tangible change in black communities, in lower income communities, and in communities of color. And you will be hard pressed to find that. And that, what that says to me is that maybe we're focusing on race too much. Maybe racism is not the root of the issue. And maybe we should reevaluate. So that was my time on Marc Lamont Hill. I'm glad I did this, got to add a few more points that I think I should have made during the video. And if there's any other points you think I missed, or somewhere where Mark, got me, put it down in the comments below, and we will look into that. I must say the comments on this YouTube video are better than I thought they were going to be. I thought I was going to get called some names, some not so nice names, as I often am called on Instagram. But these are all right. A lot of people were saying it's a civil discussion. Someone said I'm a Nigerian, so I'm not one of them. I get that all the time. Not really a substantial point here. A lot of comments about Marc Lamont Hill's eyebrows, which I guess are very expressive. And I wouldn't have known because I didn't see them during the interview. But guys, let me know your thoughts down below. Thank you so much for watching. And I'm glad I got to do this. I hope we get to have more civil debates in the future, and I will react to them on this channel and go through all the different points. Thank you so much for watching. And we'll be back for Will and Amala Live at 2:30 Pacific, 5:30 Eastern today. We're not skipping the episode. We will be here. So make sure you sign back on to watch us. Bye, guys.